Some individuals have amassed such big amounts of wealth that it's difficult to even contemplate how much they earn and how they earn it. Very often it's discovered that a lot of it doesn't come from an honest day of work, but rather from cheating people or policies. Here is a list of the world's 10 most corrupt leaders who made millions through embezzlement or fraud. Brace yourselves, for some of these stories of greed you'll hear are mind-boggling. Joseph Erap Ejercito Estrada is a Filipino politician and former actor who served as the 13th president of the country from 1998 to 2001, previously carrying out the role of vice president from 1992. In 2001, he became the first president in all of Asia to be impeached from an executive role. He's currently the mayor of Manila, the country's capital. In October 2000, a close friend of the president alleged that he had personally handed Estrada 400 million Philippine pesos as a payoff for a grassroots-based numbers game, which was hidden in a bank account, as well as 180 million peso from the government price subsidy for tobacco farmers marketing cooperative. This was caused as a result of Estrada ordering a full-blown investigation into his friend's alleged misuse of millions of pesos in public funds. After leaving the office as the 81st president of Nicaragua, Arnoldo El Gordo Aleman was arrested on charges of corruption involving around $100 million. He engaged in all sorts of illegal activities, from money laundering to fraud to electoral crimes, and was thus sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment. The corruption in his government was so widespread that 14 other people were arrested along with Aleman, some being his family members. He was infamous for using a bottomless government credit card for his personal expenses, and some of the charges revealed are quite surprising. He spent over $25,000 on his Italian honeymoon, over $68,000 on hotel expenses and handcrafts during his trip to India, and $13,000 for just one night at the Ritz-Carlton in Bali. Institutions like the World Bank found that just in the period of 1999 to 2002, Aleman and his cronies managed to embezzle around $100 million, which were laundered through shell companies and fraudulent investment accounts in Panama and the US. He too invested this money in real estate and certificates of deposit. Several of the accounts were also at the disposal of his family. Currently, there are ongoing asset recovery cases in Philippines, Singapore, and the US, and the only completed case has resulted in a repatriation of $2.7 million in 2004. The fifth prime minister of Ukraine allegedly skimmed off $200 million from state coffers, adding up to $500,000 for each day as prime minister. The funds were funneled through various bank accounts in Poland, Switzerland, and Antigua, then laundered through shell companies further used to purchase properties. In 2008, Swiss authorities arrested him on money laundering charges, but he was released a few weeks later on bail. After a few months, he was stripped of his immunity, forcing him to flee Ukraine and reach the United States. Unfortunately for him, he was detained on suspicion of illegal entry and subsequently indicted on 53 counts of conspiracy, laundering, wire fraud, and interstate transportation of stolen property. He was sentenced to 97 months of imprisonment, ordered to pay over $9 million in fines, and forfeit over $22 million in various other assets. There are still several asset recovery cases pending against him, in Liechtenstein, the US, and Switzerland, among other places. Peru's 45th president was the son of a Japanese immigrant. He was seen to be as an authoritarian strongman because of his efforts to crush nationwide terrorist insurgencies, all while rescuing the country from economic collapse. While on the surface all seemed jolly, the ground reality remains that between $1.5 to $4 billion were lost to corruption in his presidency, making his regime the most corrupt in the country's history. He personally is said to have accumulated over $600 million, which were originally public funds. In 2001, during his third term, Fujimori fled to Japan, following a billion-dollar scandal being exposed, which also involved the country's national intelligence chief. From Japan, Fujimori sought to resign his presidency via fax, a request which was rejected by the country's Congress. Surprisingly enough, he attempted to get back into power, announcing his intent to launch a new run for the hot seat. In 2005, he flew to Chile, got arrested and extradited back to Peru, and was tried for embezzlement. In 2009, he was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, after admitting he diverted $15 million of public funds to his intelligence chief. While there have been no asset recovery cases specifically involving Fujimori, a combined $172.5 million worth of funds related to his intelligence chief has been returned by Switzerland, the US, and the Cayman Islands. At the age of 19, JeanClaude "Baby Doc" Duvalier inherited Haiti's presidency following the death of his father in 1971. Being in accordance with his father's terror apparatus in Haiti, he also sought to bring about certain reforms demanded by the U.S., its greatest ally. The same year Baby Doc took over, the U.S. Commerce Department claimed that over 64% of the government's revenue had been misplaced, with millions diverted for extra budgetary expenses, which actually meant millions going into Baby Doc's Swiss accounts. In the 15 years he was in power, he and his cronies amassed between $300 to $800 million. Duvalier's presidency was an interesting regime. In 1985, 99.9% of the population supported his presidency, and he was made president for life. Ironically, in just 1 year, he was ousted by an uprising, where he fled to France to live in self-imposed exile for the next 25 years. Upon his return in 2011, he was arrested and charged with embezzlement, where he pled not guilty. He passed away in October 2014 of a heart attack, and the case could never go forward. A case was being appealed in Switzerland for $6.5 million, and there was only one other asset recovery-related case recorded. Milosevic spent 2 years as Serbia's president before becoming the president of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. After a lot of dispute in the 2000 presidential elections, he resigned his presidency, following which he was arrested by authorities and charged with corruption, misuse of power, and embezzlement. The central bank in Yugoslavia claims that as much as $4 billion have been taken, which includes the funds granted from the UN as economic sanctions for over a decade. Milosevic's close relatives and government officials have allegedly laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through front companies to Switzerland, France, Russia, and China, among others. This may come as a shock to you, but despite all the allegations of embezzlement and the large amounts involved, there were only some investigations carried out, and no asset recovery cases are on record. According to the World Bank, the Tunisian president and his inner circle have allegedly defrauded the state of between $1 and $2.6 billion during just a 7-year period. Over 21% of Tunisia's private sector profits were being illegally captured by the government, while also skimming wealth from all other sectors of the economy. When the new government confiscated his assets, it included over 550 properties, 48 boats, 40 share portfolios, 367 bank accounts, and over 400 enterprises. The total combined value of $13 billion was more than 1/4 of Tunisia's 2011 GDP. In 2011, Ben Ali and his wife were convicted by a Tunisian court and sentenced to a 35-year prison sentence. His wife reportedly fled with over 1.5 tons of gold, valued at over $50 million. Saudi Arabia has been consistently refusing Tunisia's request to extradite Ben, too. Till date, a little over $68 million has been returned. Asset recovery cases are still pending in Switzerland for over $28 million and Canada for $2.6 million. The case of the Nigerian president is a more surprising one, because he managed to amass an amount suspected to be anything from $2 to $5 billion in just 5 years of being in power. While he initially promised a return to democracy, Abacha's actions proved otherwise. Soon after being elected, he issued a decree which gave his government supreme authority, even above the jurisdiction of the courts. He's known to have been guarded by the Special Bodyguard unit of around 2,000 to 3,000 men. He gradually took control of the military, the press, and banned political activity. However, despite appalling human rights abuses, from an economic perspective, his 5-year rule was a miracle. For external debt was reduced from $36 billion to $27 billion US dollars, and foreign exchange reserves increased from over $400 million to almost $10 billion. Inflation, too, was slashed from 54 to 8.5%. His rule was cut short as he passed away shortly after getting into power from a heart attack. His and his family's wealth came through bribes paid by foreign companies doing business in Nigeria, and also through stealing from the central bank of the country. As seen in other cases, his funds too were laundered through a network of front companies, before being deposited into banks which were controlled by his family in Switzerland, Luxembourg, Jersey, and other places. In return for dropping criminal prosecution in 2002, the Abacha family agreed to return $1.2 billion taken from the central bank. Jersey returned a further $160 million the same year. This was followed by Switzerland, who in 2006 agreed to repatriate $505 million. Surprisingly, it's said that half of this amount may have been re-stolen by corrupt officials. In 1960, during the unfortunate Congo crises, the original big man of Africa, Mobutu Sese Seko, led a coup which overthrew Patrice Lumumba, who was the country's first democratically elected leader. He was appointed commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which enabled him to lead another coup less than 5 years later, installing himself as the president. He declared a regime d'exception and assumed powers, all while maintaining a patronage system as seen in Marcos' regime, ruling the country for almost a third of a century. Mobutu exploited the country's immense mineral wealth and nullified all oppositions after gaining control over the resources. Endemic corruption, mismanagement, and neglect led to hyperinflation, 4,000% per annum by 1991. This eventually led to a massive external debt and currency devaluations. Civil unrest followed. During this period of economic crisis, Mobutu amassed an alleged $4 to $5 billion, an amount equivalent to the country's foreign debt in 1989. He lived a lavish lifestyle and burned all the proceeds away. At one point, the world's leading pastry chef was made to fly in from Paris to personally deliver his birthday cake. He was also known to advise his government's ministers to steal cleverly, little by little, to avoid any legal actions being taken against them. It's rumored that all his wealth is collected somewhere in a complex network of shell companies and a few Swiss bank accounts, but little is known about the details. In 2009, Switzerland froze $6.68 million worth of Mobutu's assets, which was originally expected to be ousted back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mobutu was terminally ill and he passed away with prostate cancer in 1997. President Marcos was elected as the 10th president of the Philippines in 1965. Shortly after, in 1972, there was a widespread fear of a communist takeover, which resulted in Marcos declaring martial law. This was no less than an opportunity for him, and it managed to stay in place for the next decade. During his 21 years in power, Philippines became one of the most heavily indebted countries in Asia. There were external debts of over $28 billion in 1986, which were around $360 million just 2 decades back. The living conditions also deteriorated severely, as wages fell by 1/3 and poverty increased exponentially. During this period, Marcos is alleged to have embezzled between $5 to $10 billion. The World Bank suspected that most of his wealth came from 6 channels: establishing monopolistic control over private industries, taking over private enterprises, awarding of government loans to private individuals acting as fronts for Marcos, commissions or grants from firms working in the Philippines, stealing from foreign aid or other forms of international assistance, or even directly raiding the country's treasury and other financial institutions. Through these channels, whatever he earned would then be laundered through shell corporations and invested in U.S. real estate or deposited into various domestic or offshore banks, using code names, pseudonyms, numbered accounts, etc. In 1986, he was ousted by the People Power Revolution and fled to the U.S. In the same year, the Presidential Commission on Good Government sought to recover the ill-gotten wealth from the Marcos regime, and has thus far recovered over $3.5 billion in assets. Switzerland also contributed to this amount by returning $688 million in 2004. He lived in exile until his death in Hawaii 3.5 years later after fleeing his home country. The Indonesian president has embezzled a fortune of $15 to $35 billion over a span of 31 years in office. He rose to great power owing to his anti-communist stances, which gained him economic and diplomatic support of the Western superpowers. In his home nation, his popularity remained unparalleled due to his government's efforts for maintaining a healthy economic growth and developing healthcare, living standards, and state-of-the-art education facilities. His government followed the New Order policy, which primarily focused on building a centrally controlled, military-dominated government, which enabled him to exercise stringent control over a diverse, vast country comprising over 13,000 islands. Using patronage, he ensured loyalty from his government officials. His wealth came from a variety of strategies. For instance, he exercised control over state-run monopolies, entire industries in fact, which also granted him exclusive supply contracts and tax exemptions. These were specially granted to companies owned by his 4 children, family members, and other close acquaintances. Several other donations and charitable grants came from organizations who wished to reduce the uncertainties caused by his bureaucratic red tape governance. In layman's terms, he would get paid off by some organizations for less stringent regulation. Thus, the Suharto family established complete dominance over all economic activities and sanctions, resulting in a constant cash flow coming into the family pool. This wasn't meant to last forever, though. In 2010, the Indonesian government revolted against this unjust governance and brought a private civil action against the family for the recovery of $307.4 million. The only other case recorded was one of over $50 million being frozen by Guernsey in 2002, which was recovered from assets controlled by Suharto's son, Tommy.